già in linea?
Da che parte? Cioè, all'interno di questa? No.
So good afternoon everyone and welcome to this seminar. That's one seminar of the Think Open Achievement project. We already had several seminars on this subject, and then I want just to remind you that we will have another seminar on the 12th.
December the 12th.
December the 12th, that will be held by Massimo Grassi from University of Padua. Today's seminar will be given by Vittorio Iacovella. As you know, Vittorio is our person in charge of this Think Open project. And Vittorio today will present you a key issue related to how to promote in some way your research, but Vittorio also will present some issue that has been already discussed in previous seminar related to open publication and the different tracks that can be used to publish your data, to diffuse, that can be used to give more visibility to your data. And so thank you. And
thanks, Professor Musi. Can you hear me? I think so. So yes, increasing the impact of your research by using rich, integrated, and open access communication. This is the fourth seminar for this year, as Professor Musi was mentioning, and this will be related especially to publication and outreach part in this kind of taxonomy we are following for these seminars. This year we had already Folco Banizza presenting something related to register reports, myself presenting something related to open access, and Matteo Caffini, he presented something related to data analysis, and I think for this year it was the only talk we had on that topic. Then we had Professor Perugini and Professor Grassi, that he will talk about replicability, which is something that stays in this part: preparation, publication, and outreach. This talk won't be, let's say, that monolithic. I will switch between three topics. I will start by introducing the concept of alt metrics. Then I switch to the open access topic. This is something that would relate to what I already presented in May. And then finally, we give you sort of a quick tutorial of how to make the most out of Twitter to promote your research online. If you Google around altmetrics keyword, chances are that you will land on the altmetrics manifesto, altmetrics.org/manifesto webpage, which start with a sort of huge statement reading "No one can read everything," and that's I think it could seem to be a sort of like very trivial statement, but still it's something that really introduces us to the problem of having all these tons of research products online. And the interesting story is that researchers, they always have relied on activity-based filters to select, browse, potentially read what they consider relevant for their purposes, with and without the web. I tried to enumerate a few operations you face when you try to select something which you will finally judge worth reading and maybe citing. So sometimes you start by a keyword search, I don't know, e.g. fMRI for whatever, visual memory, whatever. I don't know, I don't want to just start saying keywords, but still, you get the concept. You go to scholar.google.com and you start typing keywords. So this is the laser pointer for today. So start typing keywords, and you have like this long list of tons of papers and titles. You start browsing around. Most of the papers you just discard because you couldn't care less about their topic. Some papers, you start visualizing maybe the title, reading the abstract, and you discard. Several papers you judge worth at least considering, and maybe you save it in your online collection. Maybe many of you have like an online reference manager like Mendeley or Site You Like and so on. Some of these papers you judge worth saving in your collection. Maybe you end up with reading them. And someday, maybe in your next work, you will cite them. And this is something like sort of like this kind of selection, browsing, and then making something worth citing out of a research product. There is also a more effective selection process, which is based on the interaction with other researchers. This is something that happens, for example, in conferences or by email, or for example with small talks in front of the coffee machine. Someone you trust, he says you should check this paper, and then for example you know for a fact that that guy, for example, he knows something about fMRI, so if he's going to suggest you an fMRI paper, chances are that you consider at least browsing that paper. And the interesting part of the story of this, let's say, century is that this kind of interaction with other researchers, which 50 years ago or 30 years ago, it happened once or twice a year at conferences. It's happening every day online, and you don't have like to travel around the world to meet other researchers and so on. You just go to a social network, you see people which you trust, like the fMRI guys and so on, mentioning papers, so you can start selecting stuff in sort of supervised way and take off with this kind of like browsing, saving, and reading operation. So these kind of operations, at least that's what I try to convey in this slide, they are related with this sort of path, which in the Altmetrics manifesto page, they call it trace of impact, because all these interactions, they are going to affect your way of viewing research, your way of doing research, your way of writing papers, and so on. Bad news is that all these interactions, if you consider as a quantifier for the impact of how many times a paper is cited, they disappear. So if you just consider as a quantifier of the impact of a research, how many times a paper is cited, you cannot really track how many times that paper was read and not cited, how many times that paper was saved in a collection, and so on and so forth. So here is where altmetrics enter. The definition is that, it's not really a definition because this is like an umbrella concept. All this stuff leaving this kind of trace of impact is related to altmetrics. So several different online activities, they form this composite trace of impact, which is different. It's not, this is something that I'm going to repeat all over this first part of the talk. This is not better than citations. Citations are still a relevant part of this quantifying the impact of a researcher's story. Because citations, they include this kind of supervised peer reviewing. So they represent a different kind of impact. The purpose of altmetrics is keeping track of all these kind of interactions. And here I included this keyword as soon as possible. It's a bit of a difficult story because this topic is studied by many disciplines, and many people from other disciplines with respect to cognitive science, for example, they stress a lot this concept that with altmetrics you can keep track of the impact of a publication immediately. I publish my paper, tomorrow I have 3,000 mentions on Twitters, that's the impact. If I publish a paper and I want to wait for 3,000 citations, I don't know, it would take 20 years, 5 years if the paper is like best paper ever in your topic. And that's, I think, a relevant part of the story because, for example, for funding agency, you don't have like, you cannot really wait 5 years or 20 years to show that your research meant something for someone else. So, keeping track of like the online activities around the research product. Let's see a few examples. Web activity, for example, HTML page views. I land on a paper, I'm visualizing that page. So that's the number of times that paper was viewed. That's an example of altmetric. PDF downloads. I land on that paper and I judge worth at least saving that information for later. That's an altmetric. Saving in a citation manager. Land on that paper. I consider it worth saving it in my collection because maybe in my next paper I'm going to cite it, but it's not necessary. I mean, it's not. I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to cite it, but still, I save it in my reference manager. So it's something which is a bit different with respect to the HTML page views and downloads. Then social media activity. Facebook mentions there are lots of people from academia, both on Facebook and on Twitter, and they talk about research products. And this small talk, let's say, which was once something a bit difficult to track. How could you track the ways in which you talk about a paper in front of the coffee machine? Here, with Twitter and Facebook mentions, you have small talk related to a paper, or maybe like relevant discussion, not just small talk, and you can keep track of this activity. And then, for example, Wikipedia mentions. I'm not going to discuss whether Wikipedia is a source you could trust or whatever. It's not the purpose of this talk, but still, it's a website which has something to do also with science, which millions of people all around the world, they browse around every day. So having a paper mentioned on Wikipedia, this should mean something related to the impact of that kind of research. I'm not saying again that this should mean something better than citations and so on and so forth, but it should mean something. And news mentions, many funding agencies, they also ask for sort of like impact of your research on, for example, your local community, because, for example, they are funding your research with money which come from the very small place you live in, and for example, having a popular science version of your paper published on a local newspaper, that should be a mention. That should be something which is which relates to the impact of your research. Maybe it's not like an impact. It's not the same impact as, let's say, having your paper cited by other 20 professors in 20 different institutions, but still, maybe it's the mention in the news that then will secure your funding for the next years. Who knows? Here I'm going to show you a seminal, I would say, paper from 2012 by Prim, Pivovar, and Heminger. These three guys, they funded also an initiative which is called Our Research, related to arithmetics and how to improve the characterization of the impact of a research by using metrics online. And this paper, so the main message of this paper is that you should kind of like abandon the concept of the impact of your research to a more generic list of impacts or impact flavors, they say, and to define, let's say, to support this this kind of message, they studied 20,000 papers published in Public Library of Science between 2003 and 2010. These papers, they included journals like PLOS Biology or PLOS Computational Biology and so on. So they took these 20,000 papers, and for each paper they extracted all the metrics that are listed in these two axes. For example, citations, which are the upper part of the metrics. Then this web activity, so page views and so on. Then social network activity, Wikipedia citations. Then other stuff like delicious bookmarks. This is something that relates to what the web was 10 years ago. You know, bookmark managers, they are not that used anymore, but still, this is a paper from 10 years ago. So they considered worth exploring that metric itself. So for each paper, for each metric, they constructed this kind of profile of metrics all over the papers, and they start correlating each profile with each other, and they build these correlation metrics. You can clearly see, just by eye, that this matrix is going to produce clusters, and each of these clusters, they connect each of these clusters in a more sophisticated way, I have to say, in the paper, but I think this, if you want to read the paper, it's on archive, just, you know, which is an online open access repository. I think this picture is, let's say, way easier to other ways to analyze this data in order to discuss. So the very first cluster here in the, like in the top right, it's cluster which relates to expert citations, let's say, PubMed Central citations, Web of Science citation, and so on and so forth. So it's clearly something which is going to produce a cluster, let's say. It's easy to show that these measures are going to be related to each other. What's interesting to notice is that there are bigger clusters which include other stuff which is not like it doesn't have a one-on-one correspondence with citations. That's what I was trying to introduce before. PDF downloads, HTML page views, Mendeley saves, and so on and so forth. This is something which is not considered by citations, but it's something which is still related to that, and it's worth at least considering. And this cluster, let's say, it's something that still, in any case, refers to expert buzz, let's say. No one from, like, no one which doesn't work, so someone who's not working in academia is not using Mendeley, let's say. But still, someone could save your paper and never cite it for some reason. But to some extent, your paper had an impact on his research. There are other interesting clusters related, let's say, other interesting messages from this correlation matrix itself. For example, the fact that these columns, one related to Facebook shares, one to Wikipedia citation, one to Twitter mention. As far as you can see here, there is something. So papers which are mentioned on Twitter or cited on Wikipedia or shared on Facebook, at that time, they generated some online activity. Even if this doesn't correlate to, let's say, expert picks, there is something there. There is something going on. So someone mentioned your work on Twitter, someone else is going to at least visualize your research. Maybe no one is going to cite it, but still, there was something going on there. And that's, the point of keeping track of this stuff by Arithmetics. So, starting also to recap this part of the talk, as Ronald and Yi in their 2013 paper, they were noticing Altmetrics are a good idea with a bad name. As far as if you were paying attention, I never use the translation from altmetrics to alternative metrics because they are not alternative. Altmetrics is not an alternative way to define someone's research. They are not alternative to impact factor. They are going to complement the information related to impact factor because they trace completely different flavors of impact of your research with respect to the impact factor. Also, I'm just going to mention that among the complementary information, let's say among the complementary features with respect to the impact factor, altmetrics, they are immediate. So they are not alternative, but in the immediate period after the publication of a research product, these kind of metrics is going to trace, to keep track of the influence of your paper. Citations, it takes years or let's say months or years to trace whether your paper had an impact to the scientific community. And finally, and this is I think something which we briefly discussed when I was mentioning delicious bookmarks. I think no one right now is using delicious bookmarks managers. And this means that what is alternative today, or in the case of people who are paper from 2012, what was alternative at that time is not alternative tomorrow or in 10 years. So it makes no sense saying that these are the alternative metrics. These are several metrics which fits with the state of the web today and the state of academia communications online today. Let's say in 5 years or in 10 years, a new social network pops up, TikTok, whatever, and people, they should start to trace other interaction online. And that's why this is a dynamic concept which is updating itself throughout the years. Of course, there are tons of online tools. You can procrastinate for years, browsing around, plotting the impact of your paper and so on. It's like Dimension.ai. It's a data browsing tool. I used it in many presentations that I gave for this kind of for the Open Science Seminars initiative. If you want, to produce those interesting plot about how many people they look for EGFMRI in 2010 and today, and so on. This is a nice tool. And then there is this altmetric with capital A. This is an initiative which is going to track all these kind of quantifiers for each paper. Let's say it's an article level, article-centered overview tool. And then there is this Plum Analytics, which is really interesting because it gives you a quick glance of the impact of your paper, putting it in a center of a hub, let's say. So with Plum Analytics, you can have a quick glance of who's reading, or let's say which kind of person is reading my paper. And then this impact story profile, this is something that is owned by our research initiative. Those guys, they wrote this kind of correlation metrics paper, and this is like a researcher-centered overview tool. It's still interesting. Good news is that we, as part of UnityN, we already have possibility to browse around these three tools. You go on Iris, the online archive for UnityN members. You already have the possibility to browse around all the altmetrics. There is also like a special, let's say a special contract with UnityN, so we have lots of information which are available just for members of UnityN coming from these three websites. And before I forget to mention it, I just want to thank Dr. Francesca Valentini, who's part of the UnityN, part of the university, in charge of like publications and so on, and had an interesting discussion with her, and she suggested me to mention this tool, browse around, play with them, and have a glance of their capabilities. Just a quick recap, it's already half an hour, so they integrate altmetrics, they integrate citation-based metrics. They qualitatively and quantitatively represent something which was already present in scientific interaction, for example, informal talk, elevator pitches, and so on. But they also show new kind of exchanges, for example, use of code and so on, and I didn't really went deep on this concept, but still. And finally, they return an immediate response to published work. So that's the first part of the talk. After this switch to open access, I think we should keep the question for the end, or yeah, okay. So open access. I mentioned in open access here. I don't want, let's say, this part of the talk just to be there and disconnected for the rest of from the rest of the talk. This is a crucial part of increasing the impact of your research by dissemination, by disseminating online. Because if you post your paper on a social network like Twitter, what you want to do, or what you want to make sure, is that that paper is accessible by everyone, everywhere. A researcher is going to use his mobile phone wherever. Just think about it. So if I'm at home, like after work, and I'm just browsing around Twitter, I don't have, for example, my university subscription, journal subscriptions. But that's the part of my day that I browse the social networks. So a click on a tweet cannot access the paper. I just discard that interaction. I'm never going back tomorrow morning when I'm at my desk to that tweet. And that's why you should, in this, let's say there are other reasons, but in this context, that's why you want your paper to be open access. I'm going to mention other relevant reasons later on in this part, but we're going there in a second. The premises of open access are that sources of knowledge, they should be readily and widely available to society. And the functional medium to this kind of exchange should be the internet. And these sources of knowledge, they include lots of stuff, but in our context, for example, original scientific research, results, raw data, and so on. People in 2003, they came out with this declaration, which was held in Berlin, which is divided in two parts. The first part states that authors and potential right holders for a contribution grant they grant free, irrevocable, worldwide right of access to their work. And a complete version of the work is deposited and thus published in at least one online repository maintained by an organization supporting open access. ResearchGate doesn't support open access. If you upload your paper on ResearchGate or academia.edu, you are not going open. Just food for thought. The first part is a declaration of intent. So it requires authors and right holders to think about granting access to their intellectual product. In this part of the declaration, there are still neither editorial nor practical implication. We're not talking about Elsevier, article processing charges, or whatever. This is a declaration of intents. I'm going to think about my research as accessible to everyone. And then, of course, the second part, the way in which an author implements the statement of depositing their work somewhere defines whether and how the piece of work is available in an open access form. So the journal editors, with their kind of like conditions and their role in determining how a work is deposited, they shape up the way in which you will be going open. But what I want to stress here is that this statement is inclusive, or inclusive, I don't know what's the answer. So it does not rule out any specific possibility for the authors to deposit the papers. With this statement, they are not like prohibiting anything. Still, they're excluding commercial initiatives, ResearchGate, academia, and so on and so forth. These two statements, they produce, or they have produced, several ways to go open. The green road, which is commonly referred to as self-archiving. The gold road, which is depositing your paper on or publishing your paper on an open access journal, or let's say a journal which is not on open access, but it offers to the authors a paid open access option. And also I had an interesting discussion with a person from Click. I don't know if anyone from Click here? Okay. There are other journals which are open access journal. They grant access to the papers for free without article processing charge. This is the Platinum road. Let's say the most common ways of going open for the cognitive neuroscience community are green and gold roads. In any case, what I'm going to illustrate today is the green road. Self-archiving, which is also the, let's say, free road. Directions are that you will submit and eventually publish your work on a subscription journal. At the same time, you will deposit a version of your work on an open access repository. It's for free. You deposit your preprint, you went open. You are fine, for example, for funding agency or for institution. Of course, these include lots of other implications that I'm not going to deepen today because we do not have time. For example, the embargo period and so on, and so all the requirements by the journal and so on and so forth. But still, what I want to stress today is that there are tons of these open access archives online. For example, bioarchive.org, which is kind of slowly establishing as one of the standards in your field, like the cognitive neuroscience field. You can deposit full papers. They grant you the digital object identifier, the DOI. You could deposit several different versions of your paper. For example, if the journal, like the the subscription journal, which publish your work if they permit you to deposit your paper in an online archive. You can deposit here the preprint, then once the paper is published and maybe the embargo period is finished, you upload the peer review version of the paper and so on. And of course, many institutions, they also own their own archive, and all these archives, they are maintained by, for example, universities. So you automatically you deposit your preprint there, and you are automatically going open. And UniTN, it has an online archive. It's called IRIS. As far as understood, this is depositing your work there is mandatory when you go through Italian or European research evaluations. So you already have all your material there. Digital object identifiers are available in some cases, and every time you deposit something there, you're going to undergo supervised sanity checks. What is worth mentioning about IRIS today, it's strictly related to the altmetrics discussion. First of all, I just want to mention that it has this kind of shared parameter integration. Shared parameter is a tool which returns you a very quick summary of which are the requirements for going open given a specific subscription journal, and IRIS already gives you the requirements once you give it the journal name. This kind of like strange sequence of words, OAIPMH, stands for Open Archive Initiative Protocol Metadata Harvesting. What does this mean? This means that many online archives, they have this OAIPMH feature. This means that when you deposit your paper on an archive which is OAIPMH ready, this means that search engine which are going to harvest for metadata, they kind of have a preferential way, let's say a preferential and ready to use way to pick your paper. Because when you deposit a paper, for example, in IRIS or in bioRxiv, you're going to include lots of metadata. This paper is about fMRI, these are the authors, and so on and so forth. So all these metadata, they are automatically harvested by search engines. So if you deposit your paper in ResearchGate, or on your website, for example, maybe many of you, they have a website pointing on, let's say, a Dropbox directory, and then going to share, let's say, PDFs from their website. It's not easy for a search engine to grab the information from your paper if you deposit it on a website, like a standard website. It's way easier if you deposit it on an archive which is OAIPMH ready. And of course, that's the point of this talk. It offers you rich, highly integrated, dynamically updated altmetrics. Here I just picked a couple of examples. Maybe some of you know this paper, which was published at CIMEC 10 years ago, I think. This is the IRIS webpage for each paper. The authors were Lignau and Karamazza. And that's the interesting part of the story. So in bottom right, you have this nice box, one with this kind of circle and one with this kind of network. These are two groups of altmetrics offered by altmetrics with the capital A and PlanX. Told you before that IRIS integrates this information. If you click here, you have a quick glance of the online activity of this paper. So it said that, for example, it was cited in a few news articles throughout the years. I mean, this is 2018, 2016, blogs, and then Twitter. So these are people citing that paper, and so on. And Wikipedia page citing that paper. Not bad. Of course, this paper was published 10 years ago. Other papers, which are from, let's say, this year, for example, is a relevant paper by people, among the others, by people from CBO. Choose this paper because it was cited in the news. Yeah. So you see that this paper, it had lots of rumors, a lot of buzz in the news, including Italian news. I'm not saying that these are, like, let's say, trustable sources, but I mean, Le Scienze, it's an important Italian journal. It's a popular science journal, so this means that this paper, in some way, if tomorrow people who wrote that paper, they have to some extent talk with a funding agency, and this funding agency is going to ask them which was the impact of your paper from, let's say, the non-scientific community. They have a quick way to say, look, this paper was cited in all this news, including an Italian journal, which is read by almost everyone. You don't have to be a scientist to read Le Scienze. And this is something which I was saying, as I was saying, it's already available in our IRIS archive. So, as an interim summary for open access, any attempt to position your research through online tools, it requires your paper to be open. So it requires you to go open in whatever way. Institutional archives are useful tools in this regard, for example, for the Green Road. And Unity has choice, which is Cinaga Iris. At the same time, it lets you go open and returns a wide range of arithmetics indicators. That was it for this open access part. I know that it was really quick, and I hope I did not confuse your thoughts about going open. But still, there are slides online of my previous talk, which deepened lots of other aspects, including the Gold Road and so on. So, switching to the final part of the talk, let's see how all this discussion about having page views, downloads, and so on is going to be boosted by using a social network like Twitter. Before starting, I have to say that I talk with many people from CIMEC and about this, and many people, they told me that they consider social media or social networks and Twitter, for example, as a source of procrastination. It's true, of course. And this was one of the most common, let's say, observation. The other common story was that on social media, you could be kind of annoying in that you can use your social media just to promote yourself. And that's true. Many people, they are on Twitter just to say, look, I just had a new position, I got my project funded, and so on and so forth. And this doesn't really mean anything for other people. It doesn't serve, let's say, this kind of goal of spreading knowledge throughout people. So the very first suggestion, if you want to use Twitter for research, is don't be annoying. On the left part of this diagram, there are, let's say this is a diagram of statuses. The red part is statuses that are annoying, and the statuses that are annoying are statuses that serve just the author. I got promoted, I bought a new car, no one cares, okay? The interesting part of the story is those statuses that do something positive for the reader. So when you're going to tweet something, just think about what this tweet could represent for someone who's reading it. People don't care if you got promoted. People care if you're going to spread, for example, a new paper with a new theory or whatever scientific achievement. There is this kind of purple part, which is interesting. So you could say, I published this paper and I got promoted. So this is a status that served, your kind of it's totally fine. I mean, you can be online just to promote yourself, but still you're doing or saying something which is useful for the other people. And then, in this kind of introduction of using Twitter in a professional way, I would suggest first, so to think about first what is the content of what you're going to tweet. Just here define this kind of axis which goes from the left to something which is completely related to entertainment, to something which is completely related to content. So you can tweet, let's say, a joke or whatever, which is something which stays here in this part. But a joke, it's not something which would be useful to spread knowledge in most of the cases. And of course, you should also be careful to tweet something which is completely content-based, let's say, very obscure part of, let's say, an elaboration of a computational model. No one is going to read it, okay? And then the other axis that I defined is related to target. So at the bottom, there is the mainstream audience, and on top, there is your bubble. And with your bubble, this bubble could be restricted as much as you want. Could be also just you and your PhD student and so on. Mainstream, on the other hand, it's everyone. So if you navigate through this kind of how do you call this? I don't know. Quadrato semiotico, maybe in Italian, whatever. This is serious red area. You don't really want to tweet something which stays in this area. Don't want, you're using Twitter for your work. You don't want to tweet memes, jokes, even good jokes, whatever. If you want to do this, you can go just like me. You have your personal Twitter account where you talk about cycling, football, Sonic Youth, and so on. And you have your professional Twitter account where you tweet stuff related to your work. But if you're tweeting from your professional account, I would suggest just to avoid, to stay far from this area. Then there is this kind of pink area. We're going to, let me introduce examples, that this would be more clear. So here in this serious red area, there are memes, jokes. No one cares about this. Don't tweet it. In the pink area, there are those content which is entertainment, but is somehow related to your bubble. So for example, inside jokes, PhD comics, XKCD, whatever. Lab life tweets, picture of your lab. This could help in communicating that your lab, it's a nice environment, so maybe people would want to work with you. Picture of your social events and so on. Whatever. The relevant part of the story is the dark green area here. And the most important bit is how to announce a research product. these kind of tweets, they lay in this top right part. So this is something that has, as a target, they are thought to be read by something which stays in your bubble, maybe a bigger bubble, maybe not just fMRI people, but cognitive science, people from cognitive science, people from psychology, people from science, whatever. And they are full of content because they have to include the DOI of your paper, of your data set, or whatever, of your research product. You tweet something related to your paper, you include the DOI, alt metrics, plumx, all those metrics, they are going to count this buzz on social media. And people, if they have the DOI, they're going to click on your paper, so they will increment the page view. And maybe trigger all that operation of saving the paper, reading the paper, putting in the reference manager, reading it, and finally citing it. So include the product DOI, put a representative figure, mention product's main messages, enumerate a few tweets to convey other relevant messages. This doesn't really mean anything. Just going to give you an example. I think all of you know Professor Gozzi. Was a nice, I think, example. And that's exactly what I was talking about. So you tweet an announcement. There's a new preprint on an online archive. So this is an open access work. You put a link. This is like a shortened link, but this is going to link to the DOI of the paper. You convey a quick message. We show that, I mean, okay, we're not going to talk about this paper, but still, quick message, and then you start like announcing brief summary, and here there is also a target, and you start enumerating your tweet, 1 out of 6. There is a picture. If you don't want to browse all the thread, you already get a glance of what's inside the paper with this picture. So if you're not interested in this, with that picture, you are going to know whether it's worth for you reading or not. And if it's worth, you can keep reading and think, this is something which is really an evolution of what was scientific communication, let's say, in the last 10 years, and what could be now. So you're going to do a sort of like elevator pitch talk or quick presentation or like poster condensed in tweets. That's, I think, really interesting because you get a glance of that paper in just a few tweets. So there are scientific questions, other pictures, comments, and so on. So this tweet is going to generate page views on that paper, readings, savings in citation manager, and maybe discussion on Twitter itself with retweets. This had 10 retweets. This means that other people, they mentioned this tweet and maybe start discussing it. That's a way, let's say, a nice way to position your paper online. Okay, there is another example. I'm not going to mention. Okay, let's just. So this neuroconscience, it's Professor Migalen. I think it's a professor from Denmark, and I think I consider this tweet because it has this interesting like pitch here. There is a statement and like a rhetorical question and a sort of like way to make you want at least deepening the topic. And here there is the DOI, bioarchive, content, and so on, the picture, and the long, let's say, and a long thread related to what's inside the paper. How do you call this? It's a talk, it's a communication, it's a comment, I don't know. What I want to say, what I want to convey here is that even if you are not going to, it's difficult to define this kind of communication online, but this is going to boost the impact of your research online. So, tweet your, let's say, use Twitter to tweet to announce your research product. And I have just another slide. You can take advantage of Twitter capabilities for both increasing your the impact of your research and to, let's say, fine-tune the process of selection of the readings I mentioned at the very initial stages of this talk. Because Twitter, it has this capability which is called lists. You can browse around academic people on Twitter, and maybe you have, like, you know, these 10 professors working with fMRI, these 10 PhD students and professors working with MEG. You can define a couple of lists. One is fMRI, one is MEG, and you know that all the people tweeting there, it's likely that they are tweeting about fMRI. And the interesting part of the story is that lists are public. So if someone which is way better than us in assessing his research on Twitter, somehow, sometimes in the past, started to fill a list, we can just view the list that he or she could defined. This guy in Euroconscience, he has lots of lists. For example, this Bayesian brain, whatever, this open science list, cogneuro list with including 569 members. That's something which could be worth exploring. Is something which should be worth following, because in this list maybe there are people from which you want to read the tweets. So lists. And then there is this tool which is called Tweetdeck, which is useful for visualization because it allows you to visualize your lists or whatever you want in columns. So maybe you follow, let's say, 100,000 people, but you don't want really to see all your timeline interacting because you don't have time and so on. You can just use Tweetdeck and divide your list. For example, I have my list related to open science and the list with mentions of CIMEC, and here I just define a column with the hashtag altmetrics when I was preparing this talk. And then maybe I finish preparing this talk, I finish giving this talk, I will delete this hashtag list. For example, tomorrow you're going to HBM 2020. I think nowadays all the conference they actually promote a hashtag, a specific hashtag, like, I don't know, hashtag OHBM 2020 and so on. For the time you're there, it's useful to define the list and have it in a column, so you can browse around the content of the conference and have it all there. And then this is the last tool I'm going to introduce. It's kind of obscure, but I think it's one of the most interesting. It's called Nuzzle. Just to say, I do not participate in any of these initiatives, so I'm not going to introduce this because of, like, personal interests. I just find this really useful. So this Nuzzle tool is going to return you those things, let's say links, retweets, whatever, which share the most, let's say, buzz from your followers. So, for example, this from people you are following. For example, this paper, establishment of best practices for evidence for prediction. I don't know what I'm talking about. I didn't read it, it just came out. But here I can see that 5 people that I follow, they are talking about this on Twitter. So maybe it's worth at least having a look to it. especially if these 5 people, they are people that I already know, that I trust, and that I kind of like know for sure that they are not going, let's say, to post bad jokes or memes. They are going to post content. So if 5 people are talking about this, maybe it's worth at least exploring what they are talking about. So this is Nuzzle. There are lots of other features of this, but they all refer to this kind of, let's say, concept. So many people are talking about this. Maybe it's worth exploring for you as well. And of course, here we go back to the DOI. All those people are talking about something which has a unique identifier. So all the movement around that kind of link, including this, they are going to be registered in the alt metrics. That was Nuzzle, and that ends also the part of Twitter for research. So Twitter, transfer online, interaction that were already common within researchers, but it also facilitates and promotes new kind of interactions. That kind of like Twitter threads, it's something which could be done only on Twitter. For some reasons, we don't really know how people are going to sit on a social network with respect to another. This is also something that is completely out of the purpose of this talk. But still, Twitter is one of the de facto standards to promote your research and increase your alt metrics. Many people from academia are on Twitter. They are not on Facebook anymore. They are not on LinkedIn, I don't know, other social network. Many people, they are on Twitter. So if you want to promote your research, maybe you could consider that it's worth exploring having a Twitter account. You could even have a Twitter account and tweeting anything, just browse around other people's tweets and steal. And it could be combined with other tools and capabilities, unleashing social network powers and capabilities. This is my last slide. Alt metrics, they're a way to integrate classical citation basic metrics, depicting many different impact flavors. Online scientific discussion, it works only if the research products are open access. This is mandatory. And Twitter is a way to connect to other scientists all over the world and promote in an immediate, this is a concept which recur throughout the talk, in an effective way your research products. As always, in the open seminars talks, I also used to give take-home practices. For example, you could check on Iris or Iris your publication or your PI publications and see the status of publication of metrics. You can just think and try to observe whether they differ from citation patterns and how. Some papers, they could have exactly the same pattern. Other papers, they could have a completely different pattern. How many of your papers, they are openly accessible? That's something that's worth exploring. And then you can consider 3 scientists in your network. You can explore whether they have a Twitter account, what do they tweet, whether it's worth connecting with them through this social network. Join us for the next Open Science Seminar, December the 12th, by Massimo Grassi. Thanks for your attention.
Question time. I think we can also take questions from the web. I'm not sure it works, but so
yeah, I'm
just one moment. Online, okay.
Okay, I think there is. Let me see. So there should be also this.
So we can.
Anyway, just start.
Thank you, Vittorio. I think you provided a wide set of useful tools for dissemination. I just wanted to make a provocative consideration. So you started by saying that no one can track the entire scientific literature because of the huge amount of scientific papers that are produced on any given topic. So I was just considering, given that difficulty, can we afford the exponential amount of information that are generated by those social tools and dissemination tools that you presented at all?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really relevant question, and it's something that I think is related to the plot that I show related to how to use Twitter. I think, let's say, those accounts which I consider more relevant are accounts which doesn't really, for example, doesn't have like automatic repost of their work and so on. So I think that this is my opinion, for sure, of course. I think that a good way to use Twitter is exactly to reduce that kind of noise and spit out already curated information for other people. So there is lots of noise, there is an incredible amount of paper coming out, but you are a human being which are going, let's say, in a position of like automatic bots just taking those papers and posting it online. You are going, for example, to select all those papers, maybe read it and tweet once a month, because that was the only time that you find something worth tweeting, or let's say 2 or 3 times a year, because those 2 or 3 times are the times when you publish something. So those are the times when you want to promote your work. So my view of this thing is like something which helps in reducing the information, or at least in fine-tuning the information. But and this is something which was taken in account in that paper from 2012. There is the risk of having like this kind of let's call it academic spam, let's say, where you have Twitter accounts which automatically post stuff online, and that's something which I can't even like place on that plot. This is something that is going to produce no information at all, in my opinion. That's at least like the social network part of this problem. Then it is a problem on itself, even without social network, and I have an answer of like increasing the quality of the research, reducing the number of papers, and so on. I don't know.
You presented a very interesting correlational plot that we all like because we're used to those kinds of representations. I thought it was interesting because, as far as I remember, if you go back to that slide, it would be useful. There were clusters that were rather independent. Indeed, the social media cluster was actually not very much correlated with the citations.
Yeah.
And if we do care about citations more than altmetrics, because this is what our agency look for, whatever university too, I wonder whether this picture is a static picture of the past, where not very many social media were used to advertise the research, and that in the future the correlation should increase, because if this is so, then it's maybe worth going into self-publishing, self-advertising kind of thing in Twitter, for example, as you proposed. But if it stays like that, why bother?
I mean, okay, yeah, I think it's a totally relevant question. I think the interesting part of the story.
But I believe that okay, paper from 2012.
Yeah.
Data are around 2010, 11.
2003, 2000.
8 years.
Yeah.
Matters.
I think.
Yeah, so maybe this picture will change over time.
Yeah, I think this is one part of the story. The fact that I think I mentioned this, that there are metrics here that are not even used anymore, because no one cares now about social bookmarking, for example. And that's also why I mentioned the fact that altmetrics, they are not a studied concept. And that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that first, I know that the important part, that citations are the most relevant part, but the altmetrics, by definition, they're going to represent something which is different with respect to citations. And okay, it's something which could be less relevant, but still it's something which is going to impact someone else's research. So even if it's not quantified or considered by funding agency, even if didn't include this information in talk, but 2013, the NSF they start changing the expression from papers to research product in their funding requests. So NSF, not let's say the last funding agency of the world. And I think it's a matter of like last week in Netherlands, they are starting to at least integrating the citation metrics with other metrics. Of course, you cannot really define, let's say, pick a couple of alt metrics and stick to that, because then you will fall in the same, let's say, place of the citation. So a metric which quantifies itself instead of quantifying the spread of knowledge. And then I think the interesting part of this correlation plot is that Twitter mentions they're going to increase, or they're going to be correlated in some way, not highly correlated, but I think here there is also sort of bias in the coloring, because of course Facebook shares are going to be correlated with Facebook clicks and so on. But still, Twitter mentions they are correlated with an increase, or they are correlated with downloads and page views.
Right. I think what it shows is that a kind of superficial approach to science, Facebook, Twitter, and downloading, without even reading and not even citing those papers, are correlated with each other, fine.
Yes.
But when you go into the paper and you decide whether it's worth citing it or not, that requires a slow approach that is far away from what we do when we click around in Twitter and
Yes, but
we download the papers.
that's,
Yes.
I mean, this is something that relates with the selection project. It is a process.
Right.
So this is going to fine-tune your selection and finally your citing, for example. And that's, let's say, the part of information altmetrics are going to grab. But what I would say is that I would be. I'm not saying that Twitter it's a slow and deep approach to science. It's not. But still, I would say that it's not always superficial, because you could convey lots of information in a series of tweets, which could change in an effective way, let's say, your approach to a topic or whatever, because they resemble. They're not going to resemble your coffee machine talk. They're going to resemble you attending a presentation.
Yeah, more and more, it's true.
And this is something which, of course, presentation is not like a slow approach of science, like sitting there reading paper and so on. But the presentation could change in a dramatic way, let's say, your views on a topic, and that's, let's say, a fair use of Twitter. What a fair use of Twitter, or let's say what I judge, what I consider a fair use of Twitter is going to affect. Then of course you can tweet around more and more, like this paper is worth reading without saying anything. But this is a tweet which doesn't serve even yourself. It doesn't serve to anyone, and that's something that refers to what I show when I say that if you want to use Twitter as a professional, as an let's say as part of the academia, you have to use it in a professional way.
Right.
So every professional way requires efforts.
So these almetrics, in these almetrics, I feel like there's something important missing that's sort of weird because it's like, I mean, it's a very old way to communicate in academia, conferences. Like, it's like conferences are not taken into account anywhere in these metrics. Like, because we communicate our papers in with posters, and it has an impact on the field, a big impact. Like, arguably maybe as big as Twitter. So it's kind of I know that's difficult to appreciate for the metrics.
Okay.
That's my question. Like, why?
So I would put this in this way. There are more and more websites. One is called Figshare, which allows you to put your poster online. So you get the DOI, and you can start tweeting around. Okay, I'm not like trying to say that you should lose your time every day tweeting around, but if you want to have, like, of course, first of all, it's still there. It's not going to die, this kind of like interaction with conference, and it has a tremendous impact on other research other researchers' work. So it's still there. No one is going to steal that kind of, or let's say close down that kind of interaction. If you want to have a way to keep track of the interactions with your poster, apart from having a physical interaction with other researchers in a conference, you can, for example, put your poster on Figshare, get a DOI, and tweet, this is my poster, it's related to whatever theory or whatever experimental acquisition. First message, second message, third message. And if someone is interested in your poster, maybe could start discussing, and this would, in any case, increase the metrics of that research product. That's something that relates to what I was saying to Professor Piazza, that more and more funding agencies, they are considering not only papers, but all the research products carrying a DOI as a way to quantify your impact on the field.
I have a couple of things to say. One is that I think that we should be more vigilant in the way we use social networks for research and science, in not following in the kind of rhetoric of the startups, because having an impact, elevator pitch, self-promotion, these are terms that all the startuppers use and use to create noise and to kind of promote themselves. So when we say our research, we want that our research have an impact, we also should be a bit vigilant in what does it mean having an impact for a research output. And I mean, if for us it's just a self-promotion, I'm agree. Otherwise, that can be handled in a different way. And the other thing is, we talk about open tools, open science and stuff, and we keep using closed source tools and social networks that they weren't made for this. So that means that we adapt our way of communicating to the way that the company behind the social network wants us to interact. So in this this sense, it would be useful to have open source social network. There are around. We don't use that, but there are.
Mastodon.
In which exactly, or others, in which we can tweak and decide for new altmetrics, not just to create another altmetrics, but to just decide as a scientific, between the scientific community, decide, okay, how we want to track the interaction between researchers, what does it mean, and so in the way that we actually build up a new matrix that can, I think, that can be more useful than using the standard social network matrix that are actually made for something else.
Yeah, I will try to be really quick. So for the first part of the question, I think okay, these expressions, they could be related to the startuppers one and whatever, and which could be or could be not relevant. What I was trying to convey is that exactly the opposite, in the sense that there should not be noise at all in what you produce on Twitter. All your tweets, they should condense information, which is
sorry. If you think, for example, in the past there were more interaction between scientists when they tweeted about about a paper, and now I see more and more just a retweet of that paper put out. There is less and less discussion. Just small sentences retweeted. Sometimes it's a cluster of people.
I see.
For example, Danny Bassett is an example of this.
Okay.
When she put out a paper and she put out a lot of bioarchive versions, she always tweet about that, and she has all the cluster of people that works with her. That makes sense. Retweeted this. This is, I think, it's a kind of approach that belongs more to other
other fields.
More an economical. I mean, of course, we compete for funding. I understand this, but if we compete for funding, we start to use specific words and rhetoric. If we adapt to a certain kind of perspective, if we use the same tools, then academia becomes something else. Then what? I don't know. Maybe
I think this is a byproduct for sure, and I think that in some sense, even if with other completely different numbers, there was also such a byproduct also in the citation way of thinking, because you produce lots of paper, people that are going to cite your paper and so on. So I don't know. I don't have a solution. What I could say is that people are not going to use other social networks like Mastodon or whatever. They're just not going to do that.
I agree.
So even if ideally it could be worth exploring other ways to communicate, especially, I'm not going to get political, but especially in those countries where, for example, you cannot, you don't have access to Twitter or whatever, maybe having an open access solution would work around, for science, for example, would work around these blocks, and that could be something which is worth exploring, but probably it's not going to be explored at least in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think it's more important to have a common decision on what does it mean.
What I would say
research has an impact, and which kind of different art matrices can we produce, or can we code to track different aspects of what's our meaning of impact and not.
Yeah, I have to say there is also this kind of movement trying to switch from impact factor and at least letting scientists think about, so not even the science, just letting scientists think about what is impact and so on, so not letting editors.
Yes.
but it's something which is, I think we are really far from a practical implementation of, and of course, you put 10 scientists in a room, you will get 12,000 definition of impact. So,
More questions? Okay, do you have questions from the network or?
la chat non so.
Want to remind you that there are free refreshments down to the bar after this. So discussion can continue, go on in the canteen. What was the
Devono stare qua, Stefano, le domande? Ok, però dietro non ce ne sono.
So no question, okay.
Se non le vedi le state
Non fanno quella
Passato.
That was the past. Okay, thank you.